Dominic Francisco presents Bound Unto Root, the Canopy. Dominic beamed. Perspiring fingers surfed obsidian hair. Gullible passion glimmered in bronze eyes. He rode every flicker of the heart, as indiscriminate as the foliage that obscured his hillside studio. An artist unencumbered by worry, a pawn of the surface level. Knees knotted around a sinuous tree trunk, a lariat that allowed his torso to contort with his canvas. The courtship of digit and timber, flirting with the novel possibilities inside of this branch. A smooth caress gleaned direction from bark and the translucent cambium beneath. He was sculpting its aura, the character oscillating from its bashful pulse. His Kelly green backpack hung an arm's length away, half-zipped and bare. Hands held all necessary instruments. A carving gouge, the fine-tuner for portraits, and a fresh cigarette, the lozenge for the bigger picture. Fluttering embers perforated eucalyptus clouds. Its soul inched towards daylight as a tapestry engraved in the skin of his hometown. Perfect a breath ago, faulty when exhaled. He was routinely a wrist away from the completion of his opus, only to discover grit he'd forgotten to chisel, crawling deeper into the caverns of instinctual distrust. But inspiration could fill these beginners' marks. Before an hour of miraculous thought mended his miscalculations, turbulence, grumbling from the grass below. Sight and body darted and wrenched, skimming clusters of green for a mouth. Outside of his periphery, laughter. From behind or above, rushing gusts of disembodied chatter. Was he being mocked? Had some vagrant stumbled upon his work and found it comical? Naked vulnerability wallowed in front of an entity that lacked the context of its intention. Every whistle in the wind embroidered his failure. He started to whimper justifications, but his monotone whine was crushed by curdled conclusions, bubbling his intestines to nervous cysts, tugging and choking. Clotted grain burst from his breathing tube. Throbbing crows circled, cawing for the spilling feed. Ravenous cacophony wrung muddy paste from wooded land. His knuckles waded through this bog, buckling until they met a hard clay, a rational ground, a sudden realization, a fickle calm. His duty was to quell an invisible suitor, to huff for their approval, to scour for validation of any proportion. Though obscure, others might find this gallery one day. Maybe his humble palettes would charm a passerby. Another would deduce something of value from his sculptures, something that could kindle derivation. Perhaps he had etched a voice that would bleed for a sensitive wanderer like himself in their hour of need. These were the seeds his art was nurturing. One day he would press his ear to congratulatory soil and be serenaded by the halm. After a considerable pause, he resumed carving. They would cheer. He would smile. With a borderless heart, nothing else was possible. The session set with the sun. Dusk peeled Dominic from the trunk and slid him down a corkscrew path to a damp field of fractured concrete. Clovers waved goodbye between paved fissures as he scampered back to the suburban grid. In a modest room amidst a gradient of bland homes, hollow allies, and miasmic onlookers awaited the beloved. Her hair quilted the cosmos, a graceful ladder swirling out of Cinderblock Valley. Starshine and felt palms softened all terrain, rolling cement into putty, massaging crystalline caves into tolerance. Momentary, measureless, sonnet sugar mesosphere hummed from her lavender larynx. Ba-bas and wool straws, shedding sheep, pulling him to sleep. Floating fleece folding into feature. A jade throne, atop a flocculent pedestal. Appreciation's grand columns, taller than he'd ever be. Sinking by comparison, tethered to grasping sod, descending into nightfall. A charcoal snow tumbled upon him. Unsolved memories of conflict froze amongst the muck of an unseen ditch. There he would hallucinate, alone, unguided, unchecked, wavering behind his slumbered lips, a garden of succulence. Neat, delicate, trimmed delights fight for stature against the arctic howls of old zealots. A contractor, a suit, an ancestor, faces he knew, teacher, counselor, daddy. Their soot tongues wrapped around the pastel curves of the fruit. Salival cackles prodded and moistened their rinds, graying their complexion with each lick, coding harvest with predisposition. Legacy's broad shoulders curved infinitely, a crooked moon above this mugging. Every rake, every sickle in Dominic's esophagus scraped and dragged and grinded to defend his crop against the mushy constitution of manhood. Guttural, crimson phlegm was a poor scarecrow. It was fodder for the grinning goons whose teeth dwarfed their victims' entirety. Their bubbling smirks spit boring. Cancerous tendrils dug their soft tips into his temples. Worthless. Stained gums brushed his scrumptious ears, and between ginger cuspids they wheezed. Pitiful. Oral visions of hell kept reason in its hiding place. But she was here to wake him from mirage. He muttered ambience at her, lacking the diction and patience to convey a night half gone. Soothsaying did not stipple his shriveling mind. Silken consonants thinned and toppled. He shrieked at them to stand back up, to stop serving the whims of those skeletal men. Her lush realms were blackening into their abyss. His muse was being corrupted before his eyes. She pleaded for reason. Mercy peeked over blanket statements, to which he clasped his rotting tonsils and gasped. Flashes of a surety swooned forward and backward, grating sanity against his strained sense of preservation. He gulped at droplets of reassurance and nicer narratives, incentives to attempt passage through the carbon blizzard. He would get better. He would stop seeing these things, stop saying these things. He promised. Just let him try. She wasn't letting him try. Please. He promised. He'd get better. Just bear it until tomorrow. It would all be better with the sun. She'd see. But his trembling glacier of insecurity only grew, and upon it she slid further from his side. The blink of an eye was months of decline. It wasn't merely this evening, but 1,000 others she'd tried to manage. A once sympathetic sculptor had deteriorated into a volatile convalescence in the shade of dreams. He was trapped beneath the ever-expanding tundra of a warping ego. Feral, furious paws scratched at fate's sleet casket. No flurry of incessant wailing, or cry of unfair treatment, or expression of mangled delusion did him any good. Screams reverberated off of the frigid dome and back into his bones. Marrow consumed by a gutless fuzz, and thus his foe was revealed. The boy unzipped his backpack, his divine toolbox, empty save for a crude hammer. A coward's gadget. Its steel sang a new plan. Brutality. Fortified by blueprint. with the measure he'd seen of matured men. He would combat the world around him as only an artist knew how, to sculpt the figure of his burden. Allegory she could witness and decipher, a redeeming statement to defeat uncertainty for her. For God, he would bludgeon this frozen earth, pounding out a place for blame on predecessor's shoulder. But this wasn't the breakthrough she needed to see, solely evidence of an inevitable trajectory. And with the wind of an opposing perspective, she evaporated into the stars. His cast collapsed. Static. He was alone. No voice of doubt. No abject failure. No glory. Thick, uncompromising silence, dripping down his ear holes, flushing out the depths. And when this saline filled his canals, he heard the hum of destiny. Broken from frost and concrete, he rummaged the curled roads of the hills for relief. Towards the trees, the giants of the world, what he had so desperately yearned to be. Trudging to the only remaining familiar, his studio. Shoes were dirtied by the earth he was no longer worthy of. His shifting backpack mimicked birdsong. Its lullaby swept through the forest. He combed bark and branch for the sap of purpose, poking and pillaging until digits deformed into vermilion syrup. Sludge ascended arbor, dragging Dominic atop the mauve skyline of his hometown. A generation stared back at him. Was it their will that spoiled his orchard? Did they poison his pipeline to a soul that dared to refute a defeatist mentality? Or had he done this to himself? Was it his ambition, his stubbornness, his paranoia that led him to these isolated heights? On the highest of pedestals, the canopy where kings sit, he slipped his backpack straps around a curved branch and slithered his serpentine head between the crevice, neck pressed to a tightening pasture. His Ouroboros. Air, breath, and mirror took flight. Vultures circling this ultimate stage. Dancing colors melded before him, and within their gurgling blot, a comfortable shape drew nearer. A mouth. This was it. The universe was finally accepting him. And its honeydew voice called, "Slow down." A parliament of feathers burst from spoken spout. Outstretched wings of gauze bandaged his drooping consciousness and lifted it away above the panorama of concrete and topiary teeth. Mortal body hung adjacent to a spirit unlatched, a man aligned with his molt. What dangled from a shoulder strap noose was the carving he whittled not long ago. A self-portrait. The sufferer. An anxious boy whose focus slipped onto others, who parted his ribs and dug deep for glory manufactured of all that made him feel less. Upon his head, a twisted circlet, self-anointed, engraved with confused affirmations, a crown of misguided ilk, acknowledged only by its wearer's vacant eyes. But Dominic could see what lay beyond this bark of insecurity. Stiff pupils that once pined for wonder. Beyond the cartilage of habit, expressions shimmering prize. The golden pith. A place of humility, gratitude, and confidence. The intrinsic blessing of imagination. The clay of dreams. Creation for its own reward, without comparison. For the sake of doing one's best. No retroactive plea for perfection, no flagellation for mistakes. Genuinely. He cradled his dead self, the old opus, as a tongue, sliding down eternity's throat. Frayed lungs expanded, vision inhaled, waiting amongst the ashen men surrounding his crop, men who trembled with the same disquiet he rode last night, and oceans more. Shoals of muscle tone, aimlessly denigrating individualism for assurance of stature. Missing parts taken from their own, each bearing a cavern of a different name, equating to the same sum. A familial toil. So he extended a hand, licking decaying tongues, love in a common language. And together, in an embrace of absent elements, filled a mutual void with the hue of forgiveness, uncovered for the first time in thousands of moons, and their tendrils, thankful for this clemency, lit a silver pathway out of the inflamed pharynx for the son of a hoarse throat. Renewed in salival placenta, jellied arms swallowed Epiphany's antidote, embracing the noose of martyr and man, shattering decomposition, Dominic and the sufferer sailed to the forest floor as one. Hugged by earth, gazing at a fading gamboge sky, longing for the beloved, for his muse, aching with remorse, and through the eye holes of the stars, rainfall, mutual tear shed, united by touch, warmed with elegancy, her compassion, her patience, her wisdom, momentary, measureless. Slow down. It's okay to have made mistakes. You've weathered the pain. You've gleaned what you can from it. There is no purpose in holding on to negativity. You're allowed to let it go. Use it as fuel. Stay true to yourself. Honestly, you're allowed to breathe again. Goodbye. Dew absorbed into his pores, tender roots embedded in skin, ripe, vibrant. Noose marks replaced by internal transition, from a deflating temperament to a dignified sentience, balanced, glistening, empathy for himself, for her, for the men inside him, for everyone he would encounter on the campaigns ahead. Steady fingers surfed obsidian hair. Bold passion glimmered in bronze eyes. Sprawled on the sylvan hills of his hometown, cherishing the flora beside him, and a life left to live, here or elsewhere. Dominic beamed. With a borderless heart, nothing else was necessary. I'll never weep enough of you, fading spring, radiant memory, harvested light, reckless shapes cast upon turning soil, the dew on a sunrise, illuminating beautiful remains, where passion outweighs ability. You were my stake, unraveling who I might be. If I could just trust myself, reaching until suddenly the entangled are
home.